You know what I hate is when Europeans tell me how embarrassing Donald Trump's foreign policy is and how betrayed Ukrainians are by the United States. They're absolutely right. I just hate it when they say it. But you know what? Europe and Ukraine are guilty in all this as well. And today I'm going to focus on what I consider the weakest link in the negotiation process: Ukraine and Europe. Okay, let's go.
Conflict, politics, military-industrial complex, technology, war. The Flash Traffic Podcast.
So I haven't been doing much Ukraine podcasting lately because I've been on a research trip to Ukraine. 2 weeks ago, I published an episode with Mark Galeotti, who is an expert in Russia and Putin, episode 181. If you haven't heard that, it's a pretty good one. Go check it out. So I'm sure I'll talk about it in following episodes. But the highlights of this trip were I got to hang out with the Ukrainians when they were doing training on urban warfare. I hung out with an artillery unit. Here's a picture I'm showing on the video right now. In this picture, they're opening up the cover and concealment, which is kind of dangerous because the Russians are always looking for you. Also, I found myself in a drone tunnel. We talk about it a lot on this podcast, but here's a video I took from the window of the vehicle of the drone tunnel. It's basically 10-foot tall tree branches with nets going over the road. So you can drive through the tunnel, and the drones, for that whatever length of the tunnel, the drones can't hit you. So that was interesting. Talked about it a lot. Never saw a drone tunnel until I was looking down at my phone and looked up, and sure enough, we're in a drone tunnel. So that was a trip. Very interesting trip. I was in the southern front near Kherson and Mykolaiv. I did not go into the city of Kherson this time. There's a lot of logistics that take place with trying to get into the city, so I wasn't able to do that. But that's just my trip to Ukraine. Another one will be, next quarter. What I want to do is a review of the negotiation process thus far. In November, Steve Witkoff and a Russian named Kirill Dmitriev crafted a 28-point peace plan. Axios leaked the 28-point peace plan, which included items such as Russia will get all of the Donbas, including the Donetsk Oblast that they do not currently control, and the front line will be frozen where it currently is in the other two oblasts of Zaporizhia and Kherson. It included a tenet that said the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the energy from the plant will be split 50-50 between Russia and Ukraine. And also what I call a very juicy point in the 28-point peace plan was point 26 that said crimes committed during the war would not be prosecuted. It didn't necessarily say war crimes. It just said crimes. So that was an interesting one. Europe came back with their own 19-point peace plan, and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff were deployed to Moscow to brief Putin on the plan. Putin himself said the 5-hour meeting was too long. Dan Driscoll, the 18-year-old Secretary of the Army, was sent to Ukraine. Apparently, his qualifications were that he was the roommate of J.D. Vance in college. On 7 December, Keith Kellogg, still the apparent envoy to Ukraine until he steps down officially in January, said at the Ronald Reagan Security Forum that we're close to a deal. There's only 2 sticking points left, which is the territory and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. 2 pretty big ones. On December 8th, Zelensky flies to London to talk to Keir Starmer, Macron, and Friedrich Merz of Germany. And according to the headline in the New York Times, quote, Europe's leaders vow to support Ukraine as talks to end war falter, end quote. Apparently, the sticking point for Ukraine is the territory. They don't want to give up the territory. And now you're all caught up on the negotiation process thus far. Europe can save Ukraine, but they probably won't. The EU is not a union of United States, just a bunch of fractured factions with common economic interests. And even those economic interests are at odds. It appears one leverage point that the EU could muster, because they can't create an adequate military opposition to Russia in terms of deterrence, is to threaten to give currently frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. And I think this would be a pretty good leverage. According to Forbes, in Europe, there is currently 245 billion of these funds. That's enough to fund the war in Ukraine for another 3 years. In September, Zelensky said that he needs about $120 billion a year to fund the war, half of which would come from the Ukrainian budget, and half of that would go directly to the Ukrainian oligarchs. Okay, he didn't say that, but he needs about $60 billion a year from Europe. So this 245 billion is enough to get Ukraine through the next 3 years, which is exactly enough time to get us to the next US presidential elections, a prospect that Putin cannot revel in. So I believe that the release of these funds to be adequately sufficient to tilt the current negotiations towards Ukraine's favor, maybe even the war over the next 3 years. Although that is unlikely because Europe. This should be a no-brainer, right? The problem is that 90% of the frozen Russian assets are held in Belgium. According to the Brussels Times, quote, the European Central Bank will not back EU loan to Ukraine funded by frozen Russian assets in Belgium, end quote. Brussels does not want to be liable for those billions when Russia inevitably sues them in international court. So we're back to a European gridlock again. The solution in my mind is pretty straightforward. Each of the 27 countries of the European Union should agree to legally be liable for a percentage of the total Russian assets in relation to the size of their GDP. So, for example, Germany, with 25% of Europe's GDP, would be legally liable for about $61 billion. Seems like an easy fix. But my guess is this is not going to happen because, again, Europe is fractured, even when it comes to simple math. And this is why they're not a part of the conversation in the negotiation, because they have no leverage. And Putin knows it, and so does Trump, and so does Xi Jinping, for that matter. Which brings me to another point, the complaint that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are the wrong people to negotiate this peace. It's not that Witkoff and Kushner are incompetent boobs. They totally are. But they can't do any worse than the Europeans did last time during the Minsk II agreements in 2015 to stop the fighting in the Donbass. After failing horribly with the Minsk I agreements, Angela Merkel from Germany and Francois Hollande, president of France, negotiated a deal with Putin that enabled the full-scale invasion in 2022. And here's what you'll never hear from the Europeans. A huge portion of Europe craves normalized relations with Russia. They like cheap gas. They like the largest country in Europe playing nice with the rest of Europe and not conducting gray warfare, not blowing up railroad tracks in Poland, or sending drones to fly around European airports, or assassinating citizens with Novichok. Much of Europe would like to see this war go away, and they don't really care how much territory a former Soviet satellite state gets consumed by Russia. Any European peace deal would be so ambiguous, there would be no point. Europe negotiating this peace would be worse than any damage Steve Witkoff could possibly do. Which brings us to Ukraine. And before I get started on Ukraine, I would like to reiterate my official position that I believe Russia is the scourge of humanity, and I hope Ukraine wins. But I'm not going to be like all these analysts who are Ukrainian cheerleaders and Ukraine can do nothing wrong, or the journalists who have been in country so long they've drank the Kool-Aid. I don't think that distorting the facts about the war in Ukraine is doing Ukraine any good. Ukraine is the most battered I have seen it since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February of 2022. What I'm showing on the screen now is the deep state Ukraine map showing Pokrovsk and the twin city of Menorod. If we look at just the advancement of the Russians in the last one day, from December 7th to December 8th, we can see that they've already closed a large portion of the salient surrounding Menorod. It's been reported that Pokrovsk has already fallen to the Russians, and Ukraine is currently still conducting defenses in the Menorod region, but probably not for long. When these two cities fall, that will tactically and operationally free up a lot of Russians to do other operations in other areas, such as Zaporizhia. So, as far as the front lines go, Ukraine is in a bad situation. These two twin cities are in a very important location to defend the rest of the Donbas. Ukraine still has a recruitment problem, and they have a desertion problem that isn't really talked about that much. Russia continues to advance, even though they continue to lose a lot of casualties. In regards to Russia's strategic air attacks against Ukrainian cities, over the weekend of 6 December, in one night, Russia launched 704 Shahed drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, mostly aimed at the energy infrastructure. Ukrainians in Kyiv are getting between 6 and 9 hours of power, and winter is coming. The blackouts are the worst I have seen since the beginning of this war. Russia has reached its stride as far as strategic air attacks, and this is only going to get worse. In regards to Ukraine's own strategic strike complex, it doesn't seem to be panning out in the numbers that were advertised. What I'm showing on the screen now is a promotional video from the company Firepoint, which produces the Firepoint 1 and 2 drones and the Flamingo cruise missile. It looks like a painfully slow process, which might explain the very low numbers of Flamingo cruise missile strikes into Russia that we've seen. Really has not panned out like they advertised. To make things worse, Firepoint may be caught up in a corruption scandal. Here's an article by David Axe, quote, Ukraine's Flamingo missile may be a lie. Despite claims, there has been very few confirmable Flamingo strikes, end quote. Which brings us to Ukraine's corruption problem, which might be Zelensky's long pole in the tent as far as weakness in the negotiation process. The title of this New York Times article is, quote, Zelensky's government sabotaged oversight, allowing corruption to fester, end quote. If you're not caught up with the corruption scandal, I'll just give you the highlights. NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, had an operation called Operation Midas, where they were investigating a corruption probe centered on an alleged $100 million kickback scheme around the state nuclear energy company Energoatom. The main perpetrator in this probe was a businessman named Timur Mindich, who was a business partner of Zelensky when Zelensky was a comedian and had a production company called Kartvotal 95. Allegedly, Mindich stole $100 million from this state nuclear company. To make matters worse, Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, was also investigated in the corruption probe. Andrei Yermak, the Ukrainian John Lovitz, resigned in late November, making a weird statement to the press that he's not a bad guy and he's going to the front. So I don't know what to make of that, but it sounds suspicious to me. So here's the rest of the story, and this is a little bit of a conspiracy theory, but I'm going to throw it out there. Two things. One, in late July of this summer, Zelensky signed a law that did away with NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. This is very suspicious because it seems like he knew something was coming. Shortly thereafter, citizens took to the Maidan to protest, and he reversed the law. Okay, this is where it gets even further into the conspiracy theory. Also in July of this year, Zelensky signed a law that did away with the requirement that Ukrainian citizens could only have one citizenship. Now they can have dual citizenship and multiple passports if they are citizens of multiple countries. What does that have to do with corruption and conspiracy, you ask? Well, remember Zelensky's buddy Mindich? Well, he, like Zelensky, is Jewish. And after this law was signed in July, Mindich became a dual citizen of Israel and Ukraine. And when the Naboo raided his house and he fled just hours before that, it is suspected that he is now hiding out in Israel. And that is the rest of the conspiracy theory. So it's not looking good for Ukraine right now. And that really decreases Zelensky's leverage in the negotiations. The front is looking terrible. Strategic strikes on Ukrainian energy continues and is getting worse. And Zelensky is embroiled in this corruption scandal. So what's my prediction on this current round of peace negotiations? I don't think it looks good. I think Putin is going to stand fast on his demand to get all of the Donbas. I think the United States is going to go along with whatever Putin wants. I think Europe is not going to be able to free those frozen assets, yet they are going to be able to convince Zelensky that he needs to keep fighting. And there we are. And we do this again in another 6 months. Okay, good chat. Bye-bye.
The Flash Traffic Podcast.